Hey, what's up? This is Kevin from Kevin's BBQ Joints, and I'm really excited to share my interview with Robert Sietsema. He is a senior restaurant critic for Eater New York. He used to work for the Village Voice, and he is someone who I've wanted to talk to for a long time. If you're just listening to this on the podcast side, I would recommend, at least for a second, jumping over at least to my Instagram or Twitter or to the YouTube side of this, because he is wearing his mask. He wears a mask when he does any publicity because he doesn't want people to know what his face looks like. He is a dyed-in-the-wool food critic who wants to stay anonymous. So that's really cool, and it's also just interesting just to see him with his mask on during the entire interview. He's had a fascinating journey to land in New York eventually, and it is chock full of dozens and dozens of great little stories, great tidbits about food, things about Jonathan Gold, Anthony Bourdain, Daniel Vaughn. We run the gamut. It jumps back and forth. I could have spent another 2 or 3 hours talking to him because he has such a wealth of knowledge. His palate is so diverse. He's been doing this for so many years, so he's seen firsthand how things have changed. And anyone that's watching or listening to this who is in the restaurant business or connected at all, or just at least knows about how Yelp has changed things, and Instagram and now TikTok, and how everyone is a food critic and everyone to get their opinion heard. And so it changes the role of a food critic. Again, I can't thank Robert enough for taking the time. I know you guys are going to thoroughly enjoy this. And if you want to follow his antics, he is mostly on Twitter, and I'll put that link below. If you're enjoying these, please subscribe. That way you don't miss out. I have a website at kevinsbbqjoints.com. I'm at Kevin's BBQ Joints on all the social media. But at the end, stay safe and be sure to visit your local barbecue joint and local restaurant. Good morning, Robert. How are you?
Pretty good. How you doing, Kevin?
I'm doing well. I'm happy that we got this going, and I've wanted to talk to you for years, and I've been a fan from afar for years, and we'll get in. I wanted people to get to know you, and maybe we should at least talk about the elephant in the room. What are you wearing, Robert?
This is actually what I look like.
Oh, that's very rude of me. I apologize.
It's a mask that I took from my daughter. Used to have a box of Halloween costumes, and I was supposed to go on TV. I didn't want to miss the opportunity, so I decided to just pick a mask out of the box. And naturally, I picked this one because it's kind of morally ambiguous. Some people look at it and they scream and they think of the devil. Other people who, the Satanists among them think, oh, good, the devil's talking to me. So, but it also kind of puts me on the side of evil when it comes to restaurants. So it makes me more able to criticize, which is part of the job.
Yeah. And so did you grew up, from what I remember, and it works because I obviously I don't know what you look like, and I was hopeful that this is the mask that you would be wearing, because this is the mask that if you Google your name anywhere, even like I think you even did a Google event, right, where you talked about
yes, indeed, yeah.
and you wore that. That's hilarious. And I'll put a link to all your books below and all your work and all. And I don't know, is the best thing Muck Rake? Is that the best way to?
I have no idea. Just go to Eater New York.
Yeah, Eater New York.
A lot of the old Village Voice pieces are there, but somehow the photos have been stripped away. So
I noticed that.
Yeah. I mean, especially these days, without photos, the criticism is nothing. People don't read it. It's like,
it's words. Yeah, I know. I've realized that things that are more photo heavy, people seem to really enjoy them a lot more. It's easy to, I guess, to digest somehow. But I wanted to get your history. I want people to get a little bit more information about you, and then also talk about New York barbecue and just the whole atmosphere of being a food critic in 2022. But did you grow up in the Midwest?
I was born in Michigan. I grew up in Chicago, in Minneapolis, and Dallas. I went to college in Austin, Texas, and then I went to grad school in Madison, Wisconsin, and then moved to New York.
That's because of your wife, right? Didn't you move?
Yes, exactly right. But it's in Texas, of course, that I developed a love for barbecue. When I lived in Minnesota, I mean, it was all like Lefka and,
What's that? What's lutefisk,
which is a kind of rotten fish, which is perfectly good. But in Texas, when I landed in a Texas high school in Dallas, I found the kids so different from the kids in Minnesota. One of the things we do at lunchtime everyone had a car. I mean, like a broken down car or something, but
Yeah, yeah.
we would jump in the car and drive like 5 or 6 miles to get lunch, you know, and to drink beer while we were driving. And we would go to this thing
Texas.
called in Texas an ice house, which is just like
Mhm.
it's like a bodega in New York. And all of those places, they sold barbecue. And the barbecue, they would, it was usually the cheapest kind of barbecue there was, which is hot links.
Okay.
And the hot links would be smoked. They put it in an ice chest, and you get the hot links and the barbecue sauce in a bun, and that was your lunch. And then you'd crack open another beer and race at about 90 miles an hour back to high school. This is like 16-year-olds.
Well, it's so funny. It's when I grew up in Los Angeles and I lived in Texas for a year, and I had never heard the term ice house before, and I never realized how accessible beer was at small little places. They'd have beer. Like, it was just such a Texas is definitely a different world. And I've never heard someone say that about their high school experience. I know that in my senior year we were allowed to leave campus, but that's Los Angeles. That's funny but that was actually a good chance to get a taste of barbecue. And those hot links, do they still resonate with you? Do you still remember what they
God, yes, so much so that when a place opened in Brooklyn, where the proprietors were from Oklahoma. See, Oklahoma barbecue in the southern part of the state and Dallas barbecue have everything in common. And one of them is that the main kind of like poor people's barbecue is hot links.
Mm-hmm.
And there's other parts of Texas like Port Arthur where sausage is everything.
Mm-hmm.
Because people can't afford to eat anything else. They can't get like fancy pork ribs and stuff like that. They eat sausages. Anyway, when this place opened in Brooklyn, I suspected they would have hot links, and they had like, all sorts of things like, that Fritos with the chili in the bag and stuff like that. Other vernacular hits, and fried bologna sandwiches were another thing that's typical of the cuisine in that area. But yes, they had real hot links that were imported from Oklahoma. And I just went apeshit. It was so good. But unfortunately, it was too big a pain in the ass. And they substituted like Polish sausage or something like that, which was also fine. But the hot links themselves, I mean, the minute you see the kind that we had like a red artificial skin on it that just, like it telegraphed the idea. This is like totally bogus. This is like artificial. And the flavor was so good. Also, I'm sure it had like liquid smoke in it or something, but
possibly, yes.
Yeah, I specifically remember the guy that sold them, who was like tremendously huge and would sit on the chest filled with, and by the way, this is somewhere around I guess it was to the west of my high school. So this would be like a little town that Dallas had grown around. And it was actually the site for like the railway station scenes in Bonnie and Clyde.
Oh, really?
So one of the best parts about eating the sausage, I don't know when Bonnie and Clyde occurred while I was living in Dallas. So I'm not quite sure how long it took us to recognize that this was like a site, or whether we
actually really cool.
Bonnie and Clyde, but the two are inextricably linked in my mind.
Did you like to fast
linked?
Linked, yes, that was very good. That was really good.
I just thought that up.
I like it. Fast forward though, I want to go back, but with Hill Country Barbecue, you've obviously had their sausage there, right?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
And when Hill Country opened up, I was like so excited, but the name stuck in my craw because the barbecue around Austin tends not to be in the Hill Country, although there's Cooper's in Llano and places like that. Cooper's is a different animal. Cooper's would even like serve lamb and stuff like that. It's like, who in God's name would eat lamb barbecue? Well, there's people that eat mutton barbecue in Kentucky, but at any rate, so they called it Hill Country, but what it should have been was black dirt farmland east of Austin in a crescent barbecue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mark Glosserman, I think, was like he's the one that opened the barbecue, and he was and still is, I guess, the son of a former mayor of Lockhart, which in some ways is like the barbecue capital of the world, although in other ways not. And there's 4 barbecues in Lockhart. Everyone thinks there's 3, but
Yes.
there's one that's like actually can be even better.
Are you saying the Chisholm Trail?
Yeah, Chisholm Trail. I guess people know about it now, but it
Oh, I
used to
don't
be
know
like,
if they do. I bet you a lot of people listening to this or watching this do not. They think of
and they don't know that the reason it's called Chisholm Trail is that's where the Chisholm Trail started in Lockhart. So, and it was the first place there to serve barbecue tacos.
Oh, I didn't know that.
In flour tortillas, and nobody else did that at the time except for like a couple of barbecues down in the valley.
That makes sense.
Way to the south that were so Mexican.
Mm-hmm.
They were just wonderful because instead of barbecue sauce, they had like pico.
Pico and and salsa. And it was
put on your barbecue.
Yeah,
and now there's that place in Austin that's also a Mexican barbecue that's getting a lot of attention.
Valentina's?
Yes, exactly. Thank you. And I was there last time I was in Austin, and it was great, but with some of the same Mexican flourishes.
So I was gonna say, do you wear that when you go? Obviously, you don't wear that. Like I just fell into the same trap that we were talking about. People thinking that you wear this when you go to restaurants, but when you travel in Austin, obviously no one knows who you are. So that's
no one knows who I am even in New York now. I mean, the importance of critics has shrunk to nothing. Pretty much. People don't read critics anymore. They expect to get all their food knowledge from Instagram.
TikTok now.
The sad thing about Instagram is that no one has even tasted the food. They just take the photographs. The photographs are beautiful. You can't tell whether the people that take the photographs got the food for free or if they're publicists or what.
Yeah, you never know. Yeah.
So it's like, it's made the critical thought and talking about food obsolete. It's dumbed down the discussion of food to the point of nothingness. So.
And how does that work into your mindset? How do you feel? Like you obviously you've explained a little bit how you feel, but that changes. I guess it changes with Eater. It changes with everything. How do you? Because I was gonna get into this a little bit later, but we could jump around because it's an interesting topic. When you set out, like say, because I saw yesterday you had a photo of a hot dog and like a rather large hot dog, but like do you must have specific goals, or do you just kind of go to what you're craving, or how do you? I'm sure you have certain ones like I want to do a list of this or create a story based around this, but and also too, like it is 6 questions in one. Your palate is you have such an interesting palate too. You're posting things on Instagram, and I'll put a link below because I think I notice stuff on Instagram more than notice stuff on Twitter. Excuse me, on Twitter more than I notice stuff.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. And that's where people should really be following you. But like you'll put tongue, or you'll put things that like a lot of people aren't. So did you grow up eating interesting things, or is that?
No, well, that's the whole key to my personality and my taste was that I grew up, in the Midwest, and I'm proud of telling people that until I went away to graduate school, pretty much, I had never had anything but an instant mashed potato. And mainly, I'd never had an eggplant. I'd never had, because the food at that time in the Midwest, even if it was food made by immigrants, they might have been Polish and they were serving mashed potatoes too. And so I had the blandest, well, it was also the proclivities of my parents, who'd grown up eating kind of Irish and Eastern European food and English food and German food. Mm-hmm. And, and they served, meatloaf and mashed potatoes and frozen vegetables. And that was, they were both scientists, so they considered that to be, God's food. It was food that was easy to prepare. You just grab the instant mashed potatoes, you put the margarine in the boiling water and just shake in the potato flakes. Also, my father was a chemical engineer and my mother was a physicist. Gotcha. And my father spent most of my childhood working as a formulator for various food companies. In other words, in those days, it was chemical engineers. Well, that was the great age of chemical food. We're talking about the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. So he was there inventing flavors And so we were exposed to all of those things, and those things gradually became more exotic, less predictable. He invented nacho flavored Doritos.
Did he?
And other similar things, funny face drinks when he worked at Pillsbury in Minneapolis, and confetti angel food cakes and stuff like that. So there was a real
Oh,
kind of
this is so
scientific,
great.
you know. But I was, when I went away to college, I was not familiar with any other kind of foods. I'd eaten barbecue at Sonny Bryant's, but when I got down to Austin, I became aware of Lockhart. At that time, it's hard to believe, but Austin was not a barbecue city, period. There was a place on Exposition way to the west where the guy who had cooked barbecue for Lyndon Johnson had a barbecue while I was at college. So we would occasionally go there in one of our cars on the way to like the Hippie Hollow, the nude beach, and we would get ribs and stuff like that. I think it was called Dale Baker Barbecue, and you can actually look this up.
I will look it up after we talk.
What's in there is that Dale Baker did the kind of semi-famous barbecues out at the LBJ Ranch. Most barbecue guys were more caterers than anything else. So I know it's hard to believe because Austin, it's like a barbecue and a good one every like 2 blocks. And
well, it's changed a lot. It changed because it was maybe 15 years ago. It was when like John Mellor came down and he had his place, and then it kind of,
and Micklethwaite and then the various people.
Aaron Franklin, remember him? I'm sure people have heard of him a little bit. Like, so
and that kind of fame attaching itself to barbecue. I mean, we have other famous barbecue people here. Often they boast of their connections with Texas barbecue. And here in New York, I mean, Texas barbecue rules. I mean, every time, we had that Arrogant Swine here, which had Carolina barbecue. We had Brother Jimmy's, which still exists. But in general, they pay homage to Texas.
Well, also remember what Brisket? What was the guy that did? He had the pop-ups.
Daniel Delaney.
Yeah, Daniel. Yeah.
He had the first time I ran into him, he had he was having a pop-up in an old Dutch cemetery in Flatbush. And I'm going like, this is insane.
That's crazy.
And he'd been an ad guy, an advertising guy, and so he was on this like so many people that did other things. Like Billy Durney used to be a bodyguard and a chauffeur, but they like jumped into barbecue like it was a religion. But like Delaney, I don't know what he's doing now, but he burned out.
Yeah, I tried to connect with him because it's such a visceral part of my memory. I remember how big a deal it was and how he was selling out way in advance, and it was like a good business model because you could sell out a ton, then you could cook. And I think he brought a pit from Franklin or from somewhere. I remember it was sort of a,
and he had it in some obscure neighborhood in Brooklyn. I think before Bushwick became a hit neighborhood, he had some like vacant lot or something. And now Billy Durney has like a weird location where he does his actual smoking that's in Red Hook still. But, if you stumbled on it, it almost looks like, oil wells or something. It's like these vertical blackened smokers kind of like lined up.
Because I think he got in trouble. Didn't he get in trouble for being too smoky?
He may have, yeah. But it looked like, some kind of like petroleum storage facility.
What's interesting is I was watching, this is very tangential, I'm not even sure if I'm going to enter it, but it's there was a show on Discovery Plus. It was called, or it's maybe Magnolia, I don't know, it's called Remotel, and it's about how they're redoing these motels across the United States. And there's one that was right next to LBJ's ranch, and it was a motel that they built really quickly for the press to stay there so that they could cover LBJ when he was in Texas. And there's a room that you could stay at called the press room, and it was where the developing room was that they had, and because the guys would just wait and then they develop their film really quickly, or they would hang out there and then be able to track him to church and things. And it was interesting because I hadn't heard about it, and I hadn't thought about LBJ until like 6 days ago when I watched that little 9-minute special. But that's interesting that you would go and get barbecue right by the guy that cooked for LBJ. Yeah, that's
and it was really the only barbecue in town for a while.
When did you get your taste for eating things that were out of the ordinary? When you went to New York, did you eat, or would you, I guess like in Texas, you never ate anything too funky, maybe tripe or things, or what were you eating?
Not even that. No,
Not
I
even.
didn't even know those things exist, and they were
Wow.
not popularly available. We forget that we are in the midst, or maybe moving toward the end of the age of foodism, which started happening probably in the mid '90s, where suddenly, instead of like going out to, cocktails, dinner, a movie, after dinner drinks, after movie drinks, or whatever, suddenly your entertainment was your dinner,
Hmm.
period. And you started paying all the money that you were paying for the other
That's
attraction
true.
of your full evening. The Broadway play, all that stuff just disappeared, and all it was eating dinner at a fancy place that everybody was talking about.
Hmm.
And also, people started cooking at home. Supermarkets popped up that had the broadest range
That's
of
true.
exotic to me, but not
Mhm.
exotic to the nationalities that invented them.
Yeah.
So yeah, you would suddenly have, Indonesian sauces and Thai curry pastes. And, you go into a Whole Foods now and it's like, it has, I would say, 200 times the range of products lined up on little tiny parts of shelves
Hmm.
that a regular supermarket would have, you know.
You had to search those out at the time. Like when I remember cooking and I needed to find some kind of, I think it was curry leaves or something, and
Yeah, yeah.
it took me a week in Los Angeles to find a place that had fresh curry leaves. And so,
And
and
at the time, Los Angeles was better than New York at that sort of thing. I mean,
probably.
especially with certain nationalities. Vietnamese food there has always been better,
Oh yeah.
although we're catching up now. But Jonathan Gold and I used to argue about which city had the better food, and he would admit to certain nationalities, and I would admit to other nationalities, and we kind of discuss. At that time, Chinese. Then we're talking about '90s. Chinese food was just exploding
Hmm.
in Los Angeles, and I remember noting that he wrote like three-quarters of his columns about Chinese restaurants, and I said, "Well, how can that be?" And then now I'm doing the same thing.
Yeah, it's
We
funny how
suddenly
that's
have
I've noticed that.
yeah, regional Chinese food is just exploding here now in a different way. It's different immigrants than the ones that were coming to Los Angeles, but an equally rich group of things.
So then, how did you get into food? Then, how I mean, food writing. Were you destined to be a scientist? Is that
Um, I would be a failed scientist. I majored in college in psychology when I went to the University of Texas at Austin. But then I went to graduate school in English. I didn't know what the hell I wanted to do except
I was
take
English?
hallucinogens and do participated demonstrations, which are now no longer called demonstrations,
No.
but protests. Yeah, well, I use the word demonstration, and people looked at me like, "Are you crazy? What are you talking about?" When I was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, I had some friends who were really interested in like Indian food, and we couldn't get it anywhere in Madison. So we started like collecting spices from spice houses. There's a famous spice house in Milwaukee. I don't remember the name of it, but it's been around forever.
Okay.
We started, because you can make masalas out of like dried spices that you get from somewhere else. And so we started like goofing around with Indian food, and we loved it. Everything there had to be improved,
Yeah.
by learning to make it yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Although I look back nostalgically at my 5 years in Madison. I never finished my PhD, of course, but there was a Chinese restaurant where the waitress was Caucasian, and she came from the mental health facility run by the state. They put her on work release,
Okay.
and they served the proprietors were Chinese immigrants, but they served this Chinese American food that was all like chow mein and chop suey. But people in Madison weren't sure about white rice.
What?
So they served it with like Wonder Bread.
What?
Yeah. So, I mean, you can't make up stories like that.
No, you
So,
can't.
but it illustrates once again how kind of bland the Midwestern food
Mhm.
was at the time. So we really had to, and we would make pilgrimages to Chicago, where we could get, African American barbecue on the South Side, which tended to be kind of saucier than
Mhm.
smokier, but we didn't know, although I did, having come from Texas. So
Yeah. But still, it was something that you enjoyed. Would you remember then your first, because you didn't start writing reviews until New York, right?
Yeah, I didn't start writing reviews until 1993. And I had been in a rock band for 14 years because if you lived in the East Village, that's what you did, or you were a complete loser.
You played
So
bass,
even
right?
if you weren't in a rock band, if you just like carried a guitar case around with you, and hit a certain number of restaurants where that sort of thing was appreciated.
Oh, that's so funny.
And so there was a critic, Bob Christgau from the Village Voice, when their regular critic went on sabbatical to Australia. That was Jeff Weinstein. He suggested that I should fill in for him while he was gone, because I'd been writing a fanzine, which is like a rock newsletter only about food. So it must have been,
And it was called Down the Hatch. Is that the?
That's right. Yeah, it must have been in the mid 80s or the early 80s that I started really exploring and becoming interested in the food of the city, especially that made by immigrants, and started writing books and collecting. I didn't write books till later, but I was doing this fanzine for years and telling people where to go to get like Burmese food, or to get like, the biggest prize was African food, which was just started appearing in the late 80s.
I remember the first time I had African food here. It blew my mind. It was.
Oh yeah. It's so, the flavor palette is so different.
Yeah.
The means of preparation, just like the pleasures of fufu, are incalculable, and and spicy goat pepper soup, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, we were becoming more interested in getting hotter and hotter food, and how hot could it be before you just killed yourself with the spice level. So
how now can you explain for something that is, because my audience, although I'm closer to your age than my audience is to my age, what a like a fanzine, or how would people find out about this? Would you drop these off places, or would people subscribe to this? Or
I was working at the time in a real estate company, because that's, as secretaries is what a lot of the rock musicians did to support themselves, because you can work in the office during the day and then you can go off and play gigs and do rehearsals at night and stuff like that. So, and one of the things that the office provided was this thing called a Xerox machine. There's no such thing anymore, as far as I can tell. You just like print it from your computer in multiples of 100.
Yeah.
But they also had like colored paper, and I worked also, I'd been working in publishing companies that published swipe file books, which had like engravings out of copyright stolen from the 19th century and stuff. And so putting these things together, I made this fanzine that was just like little short 300-word pieces about restaurants that I visited and what to get there, and sometimes how much it costs. So it usually was so cheap that nobody cares how much it costs. I started doing that, and based on that, they offered me the temporary critic position, which eventually turned into the permanent critic position
at the Village Voice.
Because at the time, people didn't write about that kind of stuff in newspapers. They wrote about kind of fancier restaurants, which were not nearly as fancy as they are now. They were more, people wrote about kind of more upscale places where one would go for a special event or something. So
it didn't take much to be fancy back then. It feels like it does.
Oh yeah. And the fancier places tended to be Italian or French. So not the kind of thing that we see today, where, they're upscale, every kind of restaurants now, which is great. Like,
and what's funny too, is when we were younger, French food was scary almost to people. Like, like, how could you even order at a place like that? What would you order? What would you get?
And that was the place where you would encounter scary organ meats.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. That's probably. So then, do you remember what was your first review then at the Village Voice?
It was a Mexican place in, it was right on, kind of under the elevated on Broadway, in a neighborhood in Williamsburg that was not considered a hipster neighborhood yet.
Not yet.
And so going there, I brought friends with me. I went a couple times. I just loved it. That was when Pueblan food was first coming into the city. You've had Mexican food forever in Los Angeles, but we didn't really start getting a substantial population of Mexican immigrants until the 1980s. At the time, the rumor was that the Volkswagen factory had shut down in the city of Puebla, and that's what it was like driving them all here. And it was true that the Volkswagen factory did shut down around then. But the fact of the matter is that in the southern part of Puebla, there had been an extended drought, and all the farm animals were just croaking in the fields and stuff. Well, in the the arid, desert-like southern part of Puebla, and that was what was driving everyone to New York. Maybe there were cheaper flights than going to Los Angeles, but we just
wonder why
having,
why they end up there.
semitas and pambazos and mole pipián, and people from Morelos followed them, and we had the food from Cuernavaca, and just it was so wonderful to see these things appearing kind of in small, out of the way places, and then suddenly getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So now there's probably 10 primary Mexican American neighborhoods. And with that came, the exploration of where the food came from and why it was this way. And these are things that you could still argue about. Bill from Eater Los Angeles says that, oh, no, the burrito, it comes from Mexico. And to me, the burrito is one of the greatest Mexican American inventions.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I don't even think. Yeah, I think I had a friend who I think in Monterey or no Chihuahua, he was saying that a place called, he wanted to open a restaurant here called Burritos Chihuahua, because as you walk down the streets of Chihuahua, you smell the tortillas and it makes your mouth salivate. And he wanted to recreate that, I think, in somewhere in San Diego.
That's nice.
Wanted to do, but he never did. I don't think he did.
My earliest experience with Mexican food was in Texas, of course.
Yeah.
Where I would go to San Antonio to get like just amazing Mexican American food. I think Tex-Mex is now a permitted term again because it's such a beloved term. But yeah, the flour tortillas, the Velveeta sluiced, enchiladas, the cheese enchiladas are another classic San Antonio Mexican. I soon learned that every city in Texas had its own Mexican American specialty. Like in Austin, the first thing I was that I was exposed to was migas.
A lot of people don't know what migas is either.
Yeah, which is I guess a form of chilaquiles. Every city has its own stuff. You got the puffy taco in San Antonio, which is
I just saw like a little piece somewhere on the puffy taco, and I don't even, because I never made my way down to San Antonio, and so I never got a chance to go to the classic puffy taco places, and I've never had a puffy taco. And then Los Angeles doesn't have. There must be a puffy taco place here, but I think that what's funny is when I went to Texas, I felt like the Mexican food was different. It was so good. It was so fantastic. So then your first one was at the Village Voice. How long were you at the Village Voice too?
20 years.
20 years. Because I think there's
1993 to 2000. No, 1993 to 2013.
Wow, that's a good amount of time. And the Village Voice, too, was an integral paper. Things like that, like there and like LA Weekly. It's interesting and sad how things have changed too, because I think is Village Voice looked at primarily online now. Do people still buy that? Does it even exist?
It keeps reviving itself like a animated corpse. It is now existing in a news box format again, where you can get a solid copy of the paper. I think it's coming out every month or maybe twice a month or something, and it's all color now, and it's it's such a valuable brand. But apart from Michael Musto's column, it's quite different. There's so much competition, and you're right, most of the stuff is online, so it's weird to see it as a throwaway, as we used to call it, which is a paper that you wrap the fish in after you read it subway.
But I loved getting the LA Weekly and the Village Voice. If I could get a copy of it, that was such a treat, because not many places here in Los Angeles could you get the Village Voice. And then when I traveled to New York, I would have it. And so then how do you get your head around the New York food scene? It's like, how did you, and did you ever, this is a question I've wanted to ask somebody for the longest time. Did you ever go to Lay Hall? You must have, right?
No, but I knew all about it.
Okay.
I knew what it was. At the time, it was considered kind of a second-rate steakhouse / French restaurant. I actually went to the Incarnation down in Wall Street.
Okay.
Which is kind of similar. I think it was actually better, but Bourdain himself admits that he was really not much of a chef. And I know saying this is like kicking a dead guy, but he was more a writer and a personality and a popularizer of cuisines all over the world. So, I mean, he did God's work, but this is the devil saying that. He did God's work,
I
but
love it.
he wasn't a great chef. He was adequate.
Because of that, he had enough knowledge that he could, be with all the chefs and at least that you have to be a chef first, I think, to be able to do what he did. Did you ever meet Anthony Bourdain?
I did on a couple of occasions. One of when Daniel, what's his name from Texas Weekly?
Vaughn?
Yeah. His first book was sponsored by Anthony Bourdain.
It's on his imprint, I think. Right?
And so I went to a reception for the book and I shook Bourdain's hand. So
did you talk? Did he know who you were, or did you just?
Well, he actually, I mean, I assume he knew who I was because he blurbed my book.
Oh.
Which I'm very grateful for, because that's probably the only reason that it sold any copies at all. But
how do you pronounce your last name?
Sietsema.
Sietsema. Okay.
Yeah, it's a Frisian name from a certain part of around Holland, Michigan. So.
Okay, because I've mispronounced it in my head, but I mispronounced a lot of people's names. When every book that I've read as a child, everything was, I always mispronounce people's names. I don't know. I have like a weird thing in my brain.
Alan Sietsema from Grub Street. He's the editor of Grub Street. He has the same name exactly, only it's spelled differently and he pronounces it differently. And we used to fight about that when we were both at Grub.
and you discussed too that
Sietsema, no, Sietsema.
But see, now you're saying it so many times that I forget how you pronounce your name. Sietsema. How about Robert S is easy, and it's Robert at Eater. If you want to write it right now, it's Robert at Eater.com. So then from Village Voice, you went to Eater, right?
I spent a couple of years as a freelancer, discovering that even though I had a reputation and had no trouble getting jobs, that if you're freelancing, you're never going to make more than half the money that you make on a staff job. Yeah. So I accepted the Amanda Klutz invitation to join the Eater staff very, very early on. I had been working freelance for them for a while. And then when Vox stepped up to buy Eater, they wanted to kind of beef up the staff. So
you've been at Eater ever since. Is that something that, I don't know how this works. Do they give you assignments, or do you have specific things that you pitch? Is that how, or is that even something
no, I'm kind of like a loose cannon. I'm very fortunate that they let me do what I do, and that's it. They try to restrain me in the editing process if they can. So
is that easy? I don't know how easy that
but
is.
But it was weird going through COVID because, you weren't allowed to criticize restaurants anymore, and people were terrified of eating in. And so, that was a fascinating time, and it may be continuing. Who knows?
Yeah, I was wondering how you go about that, because we're at a time right now where you're criticizing restaurants when they're struggling, and when it's especially in something how polarizing Yelp is. How do you go about do you feel like what do you even feel like you're writing? Do you feel like you're writing a review, or you're writing a spotlight, or what's?
The reviews have changed. I now, you're right. You can't criticize in the same way that you used to, or the way that they do it in England, where they just like rip a new asshole for a restaurant. It's basically the standard critique. So we don't do that, but my interest was always in the historical, anthropological, cultural underpinnings of restaurants anyway. So I could basically still do that. Mm-hmm. A bigger question is that there was a movement that only people of a certain ethnicity are allowed to write about that ethnicity, and which is insane.
Yeah, I agree.
Because nobody quite understands food like an outsider. So, in people that are writing about their own ethnicity tend to be like really patronizing mm-hmm. and not critical at all. So, I'm not complaining about that, but I'm lucky to still be working.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's kind of jump a little bit to the meat centric part. The barbecue sure. wise, the evolution of barbecue in New York has changed. There was like the early days you were talking about, but now how would you describe the New York barbecue scene? And are there places that you frequent?
Oh yeah, I have right around the corner from me a Mighty Quinn's where I can get like a good brisket sandwich with a couple of like small side dishes for like $10 still. So
Oh, that's not
that's a
bad.
constant go-to. I'm near Hill Country, which I still love.
Hmm.
I go to Hometown. I tend now to go to more to Industry City because it's less crowded than the one in Red Hook. But
Can you describe that one? Because I don't think a lot of people know there's a second Hometown, which they should.
you mean, yeah. And for a while, Durney was doing some of his crazy experiments there. I mean, he started like goofing around with turkey when he started losing weight and wanted to eat kind of like a less fatty barbecue.
Hmm.
He did that in Red Hook, but the pastrami, I believe it was Industry City all the way.
I
Industry
think you're right.
City is a down the hill from Red Hook, or excuse me, from Sunset Park. So it's like around 36th or 40th Street. It runs all along there, and it had been like an incubator of businesses for decades before, starting, I think, at the Second World War. And they turned it into kind of like a hipsterized food court, with a few, like, it was like what Chelsea Market became. I think that may have been the prototype, but lots of restaurants, lots of counters, bakeries, that kind of stuff in these long kind of almost military buildings with courtyards in between where they make little fire pits and shit like that. So there is a wonderful version of Hometown that is quite different in tone.
Was this the one that was supposed to be more like a deli at one point? Isn't it?
Yes, it began as a deli.
Okay.
And that's why he was doing the pastrami,
Okay.
which I declared it the best pastrami in town. And I love pastrami. The traditional pastrami is not quite so smoky. So he was careful not to make it too smoky, but pastrami with the spices rubbed on it, with the curing in brine, with all that kind of stuff. Then you put like a regular smoke on top of that. Is just, it's ecstatic.
Yes.
It's just
special.
So, and there was something nice about the location in Industry City. That's because the one in Red Hook was still laboring under this idea that if you're going to do a barbecue, you have to make it look like a Texas barbecue, complete with like kind of rustic signs and barn wood that hasn't been sanded down, and and the smokers kind of where you can admire them. I'm thinking about Kreitz or Smitty's or one of those places where it's an ordeal by smoke to get your barbecue. I mean, you have to stand in line in this room where it's like you're in Orange County or something during the wildfires. It's like you become a smoked entity yourself. So, but this place was just like a counter, and it was like a tent in back where you could like sit.
Okay.
No reference to Texas whatsoever, other than the barbecue itself.
Yeah. And did that close down a little bit during COVID time, or was that?
I think that may have been the one that was open, but I don't, remember.
It was
COVID, barbecues were especially well set up to serve people during, COVID, because they're the kind of places where a lot of people come in and they carry it out. It's not like
a lot of
place
business. Yeah.
You expect to go in and do a barn dance or whatever. It's, they were really good. Although a bunch of places did actually close down during COVID, including this one in Park Slope. I'm misremembering the name, but it literally burned down.
Oh, really? Okay. I'm trying to remember which one. Yeah.
It was really good, and it started out with like a pitmaster from Texas, and I could look it up.
It's escaped. Yeah. It's escaping.
Because it's closed now.
But for the longest time, when you hear about New York barbecue, you'd hear about Fete Saio. Am I pronouncing it right? Fete Saio or Fete
Saio? It's still there. It's still quirky and still weird. Still very much hard liquor oriented.
Okay.
That's where you get a shot of whiskey, and I tried it during. It was open all during COVID, and I tried it. I went in there because I was desperate for some brisket, I think, and all of these Texas style places in New York have these like little annoying quirks. Not very many of them, but they always want to introduce something that's annoying. And
What's the annoying thing about Fete Saio? Is it
well,
Fete Saio?
like the Dinosaur BBQ, which
Yeah, I was gonna.
started out kind of mediocre because it was like descended from a Syracuse biker bar.
Yeah, yeah.
So they play fast and loose with the name barbecue, but when it came to New York and Manhattan Valley, which is West Harlem, they started making these brisket sandwiches, and the brisket was good, but then they put this like horseradish sauce on it,
What?
which is kind of a horseradish mayo, which is kind of an upstate thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was annoying, but I think they've cut back on that now. I think that's just an option.
Dinosaur is something too that people, because Mighty Quinn's, and I've talked to Hugh before, and they have a lot of locations, which is nice to hear that it's really good, because I like Hugh. He's been really, really kind to me. But
he's from Houston.
Yeah. And he's also
yeah.
really into biking too. He's a cyclist.
Oh, really?
He's a big cyclist.
I thought you were going to say motorcyclist.
No. I don't perhaps, but I know that he bikes a lot. Like, it's something that he comes out. I think he has a place here in like near Santa Barbara or somewhere nice. Between here and LA, and he bikes a lot. That's his thing. But I think a lot of stuff for charity too. But Dinosaur is something that people, I don't think, it's not their first thought when they go to New York to go try Dinosaur BBQ. But because there's 2 locations in the city, right? Is that?
There were 4. There are now maybe 2 or 3. Yeah. The Park Slope one closed. There's a couple of them, and he has like ones in like random places. I don't remember where they are, but like Tokyo or Chicago.
Yeah, it's a weird.
I know he has one in Newark, New Jersey.
Okay.
It's not the most kind of religious barbecue place, but that's what makes it good. There's some real New York terroir there. He makes this thing that's a Syracuse specialty called salt baked potatoes. And it's really, there are things that New York has. I've got a landline. Can you believe that?
That's awesome. I like that you do.
Yeah. So
the devil has a landline.
That's going to be my autobiography title. So having the salt baked potatoes, having that kind of stuff, there are things that New York can contribute to the barbecue canon. It's not just all slavishly worshiping Texas barbecue,
which I don't think it should be.
No. And Fete Saio, they, a bunch of places here have just, including to a certain extent, hometown, have just thrown caution to the winds. And when Fete Saio opened up, they would barbecue anything. You would like go in there and you would have pigtails. Now, a pigtail, it's not like a chicken foot.
No,
it's not the kind of thing where, you want to gnaw on it all day. It's like hard as a rock. And I'm going like, pigtails? Still, I appreciated it. Anyway, their annoying feature is that the bread consists of these little tiny rolls.
Oh.
Just so if you're going to make a sandwich, it's going to be a slider.
Yeah.
So, to me, one of the most important things about Texas barbecue is not just the soda crackers that they have in the oldest places, but the Mrs. Baird's white bread.
Yeah.
Because you take the piece of white bread in one hand, you put a couple of slices of brisket on it, you put a jalapeno, you put a pickle, and no barbecue sauce. Yeah. And then you just wrap it up and you eat it like a wrap.
Yeah, maybe some onion if you.
I forgot the raw onion. Yes, yeah. You must get raw onion. So yes,
yeah, it all cuts. Yeah, don't they serve everything in mason jars too? Is that something that they?
I think that's another of the affectations. Yes,
yeah.
It's like,
I'm not sure if that annoys you or not. I don't know if that annoys you or not, but I saw someone writing a piece about a place called Mason Jar, and they're like, everything's in mason jars, even the salt shakers. And I'm like, who cares? Like great, like everything's better that way. But it's. I wanted to talk to you too about Izzys, because I think I spoke to him ages ago, like 4 or 5 years when I first started this, and it was an interesting interview. But it was interesting because for someone that is kosher to have never tried brisket, like he never had actual brisket until I think Aaron Franklin cooked him a kosher brisket one time. I think he went to Texas and Aaron Franklin cooked him, and then he went.
They have regular brisket, which is roasted with gravy. They have corned beef, which is brined and with spices and then served. and they have pastrami, which is one step beyond that,
Yeah.
which is brined, and then it's rubbed with spices and smoked. So, and the spices are interesting spices. It's like coriander and peppercorns and stuff like that. So
Definitely.
there's nothing incompatible about making that brisket by smoking, because pastrami is already smoked, although not so heavily.
True.
Daniel Vaughn and I have gone back and forth for years about my crazy theory that pastrami, New York pastrami, is owing to the pastrami made in Texas. In other words, it was invented in Texas and then came back to New York. The regular theory is that this is Romanian basturma that Romanian Jews brought here. The problem is, I looked into all the menus of old Romanian restaurants, Romanian Jewish restaurants on the Lower East Side, which is a very popular restaurant genre, and none of them serve pastrami. I mean, pastrami was something picked up as newfangled by delis like Katz's, which were originally German Jewish.
But so the early days of Katz's, did they have pastrami?
No, it says on the side, it says Fabrikwurst, which is Yiddish for sausage maker.
My
Yiddish. So anyway, who knows? Maybe but Daniel Vaughn was able to dig up these ads that were in 19th century Texas newspapers. I mean, there were like Jews all over Texas. They had kosher butcher shops, but they weren't very kosher because they often sold pork, but they would call it kosher as kind of like a term for Jewish.
Yeah.
And so he looked up these things and did further research and discovered that that brisket was a cut that no one would buy. And so not only did they use it to make their own specialties, but they said, well, let's smoke this fucker.
Yeah.
And so they probably, this is a crackpot theory and no one should believe this, but it's possible that it went back because the Jews are a peripatetic people. They move around. It's not at all impossible that people that had been in Texas came back to New York.
That would be interesting to find out the first place that ever served pastrami in New York. Then that would be,
because it wasn't the earliest kind of. And on top of that, the earliest delis, Jewish delis, were not necessarily Jewish. They were just, some of them were Gentile. At the time, there were a lot of immigrants from Germany, and they were Jewish and Christian, and they lived together in complete harmony, just like today.
Imagine that.
Well, because they were all like pretty well off, and it wasn't. They didn't have an axe to grind against their fellow kind of religionists.
That is true. That is true. It's interesting too. When I went to Katz for the first time, it's a whole thing. Like it's not just going and getting. They give you that ticket, and if you lose that ticket, do you have to pay full? Like, what is full price?
$50.
$50.
Yeah.
Oh, that weird. Like, how many people have lost tickets, you think? Or is that something that doesn't happen?
Well, nowadays it wouldn't be so hard to eat $50 worth of
I know
food. So maybe you should lose your ticket. But everyone loses their ticket. Yeah. It's just it was they have a French restaurant, of which there are very few left in Paris, called a Bouillon, which were basically working class eateries. And that's like a bouillon. It's like a place where working class people sit down and eat a sandwich or whatever. It's a very bare bones lunchroom. And now it looks exotic to us, especially with all those stupid celebrity photos all over all the walls. But it's one of New York's greatest places.
Yeah, and it's a must visit, and it's something. But it was something too, like when I did visit, because I had built it up in my head for so long. It was so different than I imagined, but also too, watching them carve the pastrami or the corned beef. It's a beautiful. Any deli, that's just my thing. I like to watch meat.
Well, hand carving is as important as it is in another thing in common with Texas. Barbecue is, you don't put that thing on a slicer. You
so there you go. There's
that's another commonality. It just shows that it's of the same vintage, though.
For sure. Yeah.
I went before, and it's much better if it's hand carved. There's only another one other deli in town that is still hand carving. So
which one is that?
Is it Fleischer's? No, it sounds like Fleischer's. It's in Greenpoint,
Okay.
and it's a new place. It's only a few years old, but
Oh, okay.
they consciously started.
I wanted to ask you, what's your favorite old time steakhouse?
Definitely Luger.
Luger?
Although I like Keen's, Luger is better. Keen's is preferable only because you can get that so-called mutton chop, which is not really mutton, it's lamb. I was talking to the guys that own Dhamaka, which is one of the kind of upscale Indian restaurants here that's like wildly popular. And they were telling me that to get mutton, you have to go to Arizona. That's where they get their mutton, because you just literally, there is no market for the kind of aged sheep that has the tough. And of course, if you go to Owensboro, Kentucky, too, you can get mutton. I mean, mutton was a favorite barbecue meat in certain parts.
Oh, yeah.
Supposedly, the barbecue in Owensboro was invented not by German farmers or by African-American shopkeepers, but by Dutch shepherds, he says proudly.
Interesting.
In the 18th century. That they would take the sheep that were old and weren't producing wool anymore and barbecue their necks and stuff like that. So
that makes
you can still, I mean, at least the last time I went to Owensboro, Kentucky, which is the birthplace and home of Johnny Depp. You could, and there's mutton barbecues all over North Kentucky, but you could get, cuts like the spine and the, things that are not normally considered tasty morsels of meat.
I didn't know. I think that's one of the best things we've learned is that Johnny Depp came from Owensboro. He doesn't represent it. He never talks about it.
No, well, I can see why.
I think he has other fish to fry right now.
I love these non-spectacular towns. Like if I hadn't gone to Snow's, I never would have gone to Lexington, Texas. It's so out of the way, but just to see what places like that are like is just golden. That's the best reason I know for food tourism, other than learning things about people that are not like yourself.
Definitely. And I think that's the best part. And that's something too. My dad's 13 years passed away, but his thing was he always wanted to travel more across the United States. He said, people can go to Europe, people can go anywhere, Asia, but there's so much to see in the United States, and there's so many little small towns, and there's so much great food and local cuisine. And that's, I agree completely. But why do you like Peter Luger so much? Is it just because it's just the pinnacle?
It's that good.
Yeah.
And also the fact that the steaks are a ritual. The way they do it, like tilting the steak in the plate. And these now Serbian waiters, I mean, it used to be German waiters years ago, but they have this panache about them. They have this style. That doesn't mean they're friendly or they're nice or anything. It just means that you go to begin with, there's no choice of steaks either. Like it's a porterhouse or occasionally like a ribeye, but that's only when they run out of porterhouses. Also, it's prime meat, which is now with the Black Angus everywhere. They call that prime sometimes, but it's not graded in the same way. So, and of course, that's Aaron Franklin's dirty secret. The way he became the best barbecue in the world is not by using the shit grade of meat and barbecuing the crap out of it, by just saying, hey, I'm just going to use prime meat. Mm-hmm. It's going to taste like a million times better. And
definitely. And there is a difference. I think that people have had good steaks, and then when you go somewhere really good for a good steakhouse or really good barbecue and they're using prime meat, there's that epiphany that it's like, oh, this is what I've been missing all these years. I would love to maybe do a part 2 in 6 months. I would love to talk more. Maybe I can come with more concise questions, but I just wanted people to get to know you a little bit better and to get a handle as to what the food scene is right now in New York. And there's so much to eat in New York. It's difficult. Is there a favorite do you have a favorite hot dog place? That's like, I don't know.
I would say Gray's Papaya, which is up at 72nd and Broadway. Good place for the very distinctive natural skinned New York Franks. Don't dare put relish or ketchup on it because that's they do have that there, and I see people doing it, and makes me want to tear my artificial hair out. But yeah, the New York Frank has, sauerkraut and mustard are the standard. And some Greek guy invented this like weird canned onion thing. Stay away from that too. Just
those like
sauerkraut and mustard.
those red onion things. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, they're weird, but I mean, some people like them. Use it if you want, or go across the river in the PATH train to Boulevard Drinks, which is right near the third stop on the PATH going toward Newark.
Okay.
And it's a Journal Square, right on the square. And there they have their so-called chili, which isn't chili, but a Greek meat sauce with lots of cinnamon in it. So and that's what they put on their Franks. And it has onions chopped up in it too. So.
Oh, that sounds so good. And it's funny too. We could do a whole thing on hot dogs in New York, I'm sure. But let's kind of end this now.
Okay,
I
cool.
appreciate the fact that that you took the time, and this is so, I've wanted to talk to you forever, and I appreciate what you do, and I also appreciate the fact that you're anonymous. I think in this day and age, everyone wants to show their face, especially close-ups of themselves eating, which is I'm the least fan of that. But I appreciate what you're doing, and thank you for your hard work, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me. And
thanks, Kevin. This has been fun, and looking forward to doing it again.
Have a great week, and thanks for keeping up with my new $5,000 purchase. Gosh, I can't believe how much money I had to spend on a new computer, but it's an investment, right? It's oh Lord, yesterday was hell. Anyways, have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okie doke. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, sir. All right, bye.